Beautiful davening today. We're going to continue with a little Torah study, and I'm going to distribute up. Thank you. There should be enough for everyone. As I spoke about last night, I've been very struck this week when I read the passage, particularly the one that says you should not wrong another person. And I spoke about that last night, and I want us to focus on that this morning. The passage from Bahar, it may have been put in the chat if you're at home via live stream, and if you know how to get into the chat, you can probably just click on a link and it'll open another screen for you. So you're welcome to sort of look at that screen. And if you're at home and you have comments to anything we do in our discussion, you're welcome to put comments and thoughts into the chat about this discussion as we go. The context, as we heard, was how the original land at a Jubilee year, at a Yovel, reverts back to its original owners. We read about that this morning. And therefore, when land is sold or bought, the price of the transaction is based on the number of harvests until the next Jubilee year, to that next 50 years, right? Because if you buy it in the second year, you're going to have a piece of land then it'll be 47 years. And so you'll have 47 harvests before it reverts to its original owners if they want it. But if you buy it in the 47th year, you only have 2 years left, right? So there will be a difference in price based on that. Those of us who live in the desert know this very well, because if there's a lease of the land that's owned by the Native American community, and the lease, it might be a 99-year lease, but if there's only 3 years left in the lease and you buy a home in that community, then you don't know what's going to happen with the lease, if it will be renewed or not, right? Or if that renewed at a higher price, it might cause your own HOAs to jump higher, etc. So all of this from the Torah always remains fresh and relevant. What I want us to do, though, is to look at this first, about the passage that I want us to focus on today. And it says, when you sell property to your fellow, to another person, or purchase from the hand of your fellow, al tonu each other. By the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your fellow, and by the number of years that one shall sell to you. The larger the number of the years, the more you shall pay for its purchase. While the smaller the number of the years left, the less you shall pay for its purchase, since that one is selling you the number of yields. Lo tonu each other, and you shall fear or revere your God, for I am HaYam your God. So the first piece that I just wanted us to notice is al tonu, which I have been translating along with the Jewish Publication Society's translation, what we have in our HaYam, as wrong. But it's very interesting. I checked ArtScroll, and ArtScroll uses two terms, one in each place. In verse 14, ArtScroll says the word means victimize, and in verse 17, they translate the same word as harass. Dr. Everett Fox from Brandeis University uses the word maltreat, while the great Dr. Richard Elliott Friedman uses the term persecute. So do those terms, are they really interchangeable in English? Are they all synonyms that we can translate one word in all these different ways? Because to me, victimize, wrong, maltreat, persecute, and harass have very different kinds of meanings. Do they to you, or are they similar to you? Anybody? Brenda? Yeah, wrong doesn't necessarily mean to persecute or victimize, right? Because you could wrong somebody accidentally, right? But to me, victimize, and as to you, Brenda, victimize or persecute, for example, seem to be very intentional, right? So I'm not sure, perhaps ArtScroll in using victimize thinks that it needs to be an intentional thing, whereas the JPS or Everett Fox in the use of the word wrong may be unintentional or intentional, right? It could be either. So that's something just to keep in mind. How intentional are we when we wrong somebody else? And how can we be made aware when we're wronging someone intentionally? How can we get greater awareness so we can even avoid that? So I want to go to Rashi, and today we're going to compare Rashi and Ibn Ezra's treatment. So Rashi, when he talks about al tonu, he says ona'at mamon. This refers to wronging in financial matters or in money matters. Mamon is still used today to mean money in modern Hebrew. And then in the third time, he changes his mind. In verse 17. There, when it says velo tonu, he says, Khan, he's here al ona atavarim. Here, scripture warns against wronging by words. So, I don't know. When I read, when you sell property to another, you should not wrong each other each time. How many of you thought that one of them might be referring to financial matters and one might be referring to words? Did anybody have that? I certainly didn't. So why do you think Rashi interpreted the same word as, even though he interprets it the same way, you shall not wrong, one is wronging by words and one is wronging by financial matters? Why might Rashi have interpreted something in two different ways? Yes.
Jumping back a little bit, Joel thought that the previous question was if it covers both intentional and mistaken.
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Joel. Yes, it may be, and sometimes we don't give the Torah enough credit for actually, like all good literature, sometimes containing multiple meanings. It doesn't have to be one or the other, can be both. So it could be, the Torah could mean both to wrong unintentionally and to wrong intentionally. To wrong can just carry both meanings, right? So thank you, Joel, for pointing that out. Here, our question with Rashi is, why would Rashi say that in one sense it means wronging by words, unintentionally or intentionally, and one is wronging financially, unintentionally or intentionally? Why would Rashi say one is financial and one is verbal? Yes?
Well, perhaps it's because the Torah does not use the same phrase twice.
Absolutely. Great, Mayan. The ain, there's no dross, there's no superfluity in the Torah. The Torah does not repeat things willy-nilly. It actually, if it seemingly repeats things, it must be for a reason. So a similar command can't refer to the exact same thing. That would not make sense. By the way, that's exactly what literary critics do. A modern literary critic will look at a piece of literature, and if something seems to be repeated, the literary critic will say, why would an author want to seemingly repeat things? So something that looks like a repetition, theoretically couldn't mean a repetition.
But it's not a repetition. Because the first one says, al tonu, the second one says, velo tonu. And although al and velo are very similar, there are nuances. And usually when the Torah wants the same thing said, it would use the same terms.
Beautiful. So Mayan has noticed another difference, because the first one for the negative don't uses al, and for the verse 17 it actually doesn't say al but lo tonu. They actually mean in English the exact same thing, but Mayan is drawing an inference that maybe by using a different phraseology for the negative don't, that perhaps it does signal additional way to signal a different intention behind it. That could be what's affecting Rashi as well. The fact that one is lo tonu, one is al tonu, and so therefore, while even if it's not intended by the text, Rashi has a very good midrash for us. That's midrash halakha that we should follow. We shouldn't wrong people in any way. We shouldn't wrong people financially if we're business people or if we're going to buy something, and we shouldn't wrong somebody with our words, whether they're in front of us or behind their backs. So that's really, really great. Thank you for that. I want to move on And if you go to the flip side of the page, we have Abraham ibn Ezra. Now, Rashi had lived about 50 years or so before, was born 50 years or so before Abraham ibn Ezra. Rashi was from France. Ibn Ezra, Abraham ibn Ezra, who is the partner of Yehuda Halevi, he has a different reading of this verse in Spain. And what he says is, Azhara lemocher ki harishon lakoneh. He's commenting on the last instant, and he says this latter instance in verse 17 must be understood as a warning to the seller, because in the first event, in verse 14, it must refer to the buyer. That's really interesting in and of itself, right? Because sometimes when we think of somebody in business, we usually think it's the seller who might be doing something a little shady to the buyer, right? But we can all know that, like for Passover, sometimes prices for Passover food 3 weeks before gets raised from what it was on the same shelf a week earlier. So we know of that possibility happening. But can somebody give me an instance how a buyer might try to scam the seller? Is that even possible? Because even Ezra thinks that it's possible. Yes, Phil?
They could rip the package
Ah.
and say, oh, look, I need to have a discount for that.
So they could rip the package or try to damage it seemingly and somehow and say, boy, I found this on the shelf damaged, or I found this ripped. I still want to buy it. Can I get a discount? So it is possible, theoretically, for a buyer to do something that's not right, and maybe couldn't be seen doing it, so no one would ever know, right? It's a moment between you and God if there's no one else around, and there's no video camera that could have caught you doing it, right? So, how could the seller know about it? Sometimes somebody could take the tape that has a price off a lower object and put it on the higher object,
Yes.
right? And so they could claim, oh, it says right here, not $9.99, but $4.99. Well, what is the person to do? They probably feel they have to honor the price, or there's a mistake. It was put in wrong into the computer, and they sell you for a lower one, but you've actually scammed them. So Abraham ibn Ezra has a great point in his Midrash Halakha that sometimes people will scam you. Might be the seller, it might be the buyer. So we actually, when a situation comes before us, we shouldn't be prejudiced thinking it must be this person who's wrong. We actually have to find out the facts, find out what was going on, and not make assumptions that one person is wronging another. First of all, in some cases, maybe nobody wronged, but in some cases where there is wrong, we shouldn't automatically think it was this person and not that person, right? Because it might have been either. And that's really a great point. So we want to, before we move on, want to think about what is this difference between Rashi and Ibn Ezra. Anybody have a thought about their differences here? What's guiding them differently? So in my thinking, that Rashi encourages us to ponder actually and consider the nature of maltreatment. Is maltreatment solely an act that results in a tangible outcome, in this case financial? Or can maltreatment sometimes not have a something that we can see as a outcome? Because sometimes if I hurt you with words, first of all, if I talk behind your back, God forbid, you may not even know about it. Where is the harm, you might say? Or if I say something to you that just hurts you, okay, so you're hurt. We're all big boys and girls. We'll get over it. So it's not really a hurt, you might think. So Rashi encourages us by saying it's words or financial to say that hurt can sometimes be an actual hurt to a piece of property or something we own or something physical we can see. But sometimes hurt is inside. And that's just as bad and sometimes worse if we hurt emotionally or spiritually or psychologically. So that's his point. Ibn Ezra wants us to focus on the identity of the maltreatment, of the one who's doing the maltreating, encourages us to be aware that there are two sides to almost every story. That is, it's not only one-way street when you have relationships. And whether those relationships are business or social or synagogal, if that's how to pronounce that word, then there always are two sides. And we shouldn't presume that a board member is right and a non-board member isn't, for example. Or someone who davens regularly on Shabbat is more right than somebody who doesn't come regularly. We should not be making assumptions like that. We should be, according to Ibn Ezra, try to understand that there are always going to be two sides. And that goes for family situations between siblings, between parents and children. It goes between teachers and students, between employers and employees. Both sides have a side, and both sides can wound, whether with words or not, and both sides can uplift and encourage and support. On which side do we want to be? I would say Ibn Ezra wants us to ask. I want us to go to one final stage of this deep dive into not wronging others. And that is that the last verse, verse 17, actually gives us a reason. And the reason is, V'yareta me Elohecha, because you shall either fear or revere your God. And you can see I put the Rashi and the Ibn Ezra on here. And Rashi says the following: one should not annoy their fellow, nor give them advice that is not appropriate for them. And if you will say, who will know if I had bad intentions when I gave those words, gave that advice, or did that action? No one will even find out. For this reason, the Torah text states, you shall fear your God. The one who knows thoughts also knows your intentions. So that is Rashi, which is really, really a great statement. About knowing our intentions. Maybe no one else will know, but God certainly will. No other human will know, but God will know. Let's see what Ibn Ezra has to say. Ibn Ezra says the following: you shall revere your God to warn both the seller and the buyer that God will punish whoever maltreats or takes advantage of their fellow. Again, whereas Rashi talks about the effect that it has and the hurt, Ibn Ezra wants us to focus on the person, you and me. And obviously, if we take in both Rashi and Ibn Ezra, we'll be doing good. But I'd like to get to my final point, is that I believe that Rashi and Ibn Ezra, well, let's just even review for a second. Rashi says that the wronging is both verbal and physical. Ibn Ezra says the wronging can be done by either party to a transaction. And Rashi says that if you do it even when you think no one else will know, God will know. And Ibn Ezra says that may be true, but we also have to warn people and tell people and teach people and mentor people that you might be a parent, you might be a child, you might be a rabbi, you might be a congregant, you might be an employee, you might be an employer. But on whatever side of the coin you are, you have the ability to both mistreat and to uplift. And we need to be taking in our moment and the potential of our moment to wound or to heal at any given time. But I also think there's a theological difference that they're driving at, both of their beautiful Torahs that they offer us this morning. I would suggest that Rashi's God is an internal God, a conscience, a presence that will hopefully motivate one to refrain from behaving inappropriately. Ibn Ezra's God is actually an external God. It's a God that the fear of some looming punishment will hopefully deter one from appropriately behaving. We may not be able to ascribe to both of those gods always or at the same time or any given moment. Some of us might like the idea of a God who's out there somehow, with whom we can actually have some sort of relationship, even if we don't feel it all the time, but we can feel it at Mount Sinai moments in our lives. And some of us might like the idea of a God that's internal, who motivates our conscience and our drive towards justice and to goodness and kindness. But we don't necessarily have to think of those gods as necessarily being separate. They might be two sides of the same coin, which we shouldn't have brought into Shul on Shabbos. But the theological coin we should always carry around with us. And I believe that it's really great that they state it in those kinds of ways, because we're all different. And the kind of theology that motivates me and impels me to bring out the sweetest self in my neshama and to become the best person I can be, which means that I'm always on a journey that's in process, is actually a beautiful thing. But also sometimes the God who's out there and who is watching over me and who's caring very much that I be a member of the covenant and do the right thing, and that I won't be living up to my agreements of the covenant. And that might be in some ways cutting myself out of the covenant and relationship with God, because God cares very much about who I am as a member of the covenant. That kind of God's different than an internal God, but might also be compelling and also have a place and will motivate some for whom the internal God doesn't work, right? Because that internal God may not work if you're the kind of person who thinks, no one saw me, I won't get away with it. But if you say, God saw you and get away with it, that might motivate you. So we need both kinds of theologies, and we need all of the kind of Torah that Rashi and Ibn Ezra brought to our attention today to teach us that don't wronging another. It sounds so simple, but as we had discussed last night, as we saw this morning from Rashi and Ibn Ezra, it's very, very far from simple. And in every moment, we could either stay at the bottom of Mount Sinai, or we could rise to the top. And I pray that as we journey towards Shavuot and to our Mount Sinai moment once again, that we'll think of ways that we can keep making Aliyah to the summit of Mount Sinai spiritually in our lives. And I'll look forward to celebrating that together. But thank you so much for your Torah today and for your attention for this discussion. But we have to move forward with our davening.